Hello Internet, this is Diego Caleiro, if probably wrong. I'm going to talk today about the debate that Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris had in Vancouver in June 2018, and I'm going to try to provide an evolutionary anthropologist perspective that I hope can be the bridge between the metaphysical paradigm from which Sam Harris is coming and from which Jordan Peterson is coming. And in order to do that, I'm going to start off by giving an example of something that they disagreed about in discussion, and then I'm going to use that example to make the case for evolutionary anthropology as the bridging field that would connect their perspectives, and then use that perspective to analyze a few of the other disagreements that occurred in the second part of the debate. You can probably find the audio on YouTube. So one big disagreement that they had or discussion was about the concept of sacrifice and how it's present in archetypal, biblical, mythical narratives. And Sam Harris was saying that sacrifice is a product of ignorance in great part, and that moral reasoning would and should not be used to justify sacrifice in any possible ways. Peterson countenanced that by saying that the archetypal stories that have been crystallized in the Bible and other mythologies are stories of a time in which economic scarcity was much more striking, so sacrifice was actually more often necessary, and also from the perspective that you can take sacrifice, human sacrifice, animal sacrifice, etc., as the learning of one's willingness to sacrifice the present for the future as a metaphor, and not only as a literal case of like actually sacrificing your second-born child or whichever child is smaller or something like that. So in this particular case, I mean, it's fairly clear that if you take an individual moral reasoning perspective, that is, if you reason from the armchair as one philosopher, as most philosophers actually do, you won't be able to find a logical justification for sacrifice. But if you think about it from an evolutionary biology perspective, and if you think of a group as an evolutionary unit of selection, then in order to save on resources, it sometimes is the case that part of the group needs to be sacrificed in order for the rest to be able to accrue resources. That isn't a desirable feature of the world, it's just a feature that any system that is dealing with scarcity and constraints has to deal. So if you think of the group as a unit of selection, then there is going to be value in sacrifice even of individuals at times, so that the group may thrive under conditions of scarcity or under conditions of too much harshness. So in many societies, even today, but definitely in the evolutionary further past, women will often sacrifice one or two twin children, and in general, infanticide has been practiced by many societies that were under conditions of enormous deprivation in comparison to what basically any society has nowadays. So in this case, even though one could try to argue from a metaphysical perspective what the value of sacrifice is and whether the metaphor is the valuable thing or the actual sacrifice, and which types of reasons we should be using in order to determine whether sacrifice as archetypal morality is desirable or not, we can instead look at the evolutionary anthropology perspective using populations as a unit of selection and conclude that sacrifice had an evolutionary value for most of human history, and some aspects of sacrifice are still valuable from an evolutionary, from an economics perspective. In fact, the individual sacrifice of parts of ourselves so that other parts of ourselves may thrive, as I think Sam Harris points out later in the debate, is a valuable framework through which to live life from the perspective of the reproduction of one's genes, or from the perspective of increasing one's probability of reaching retirement age according to one's plans. So now let's look from this unit of selection perspective, like thinking of a group and what is valuable for that group and what is economic for that group and what is costly for that group over longer time spans, to see other points of disagreement that happened during that debate. So at some point, Sam points out that frequently taking these older evolutionary explanations is akin to committing the genetic fallacy. That is the fallacy that something's origin justifies its current position in the value hierarchy. Except if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it may be the case that the time span through which the archetypal stories crystallized in the Christian Bible and the Jewish Torah have evolved might be too long for any individual to be able to reason through armchair reasoning about whether they're valuable or not. And the genetic fallacy isn't a fallacy if you telescope sufficiently much of the future into your scope of explanation. That is, the origin of something being an evolutionary origin at the time of scarcity might be an indication of something that we are not cognitively prepared to reason about, because the level of intelligence that evolved in order to make that information be propagated into the future actually evolved not within human brains or within the explicit language organization of human society, but instead it evolved through either a meta-level intelligence of groups and of systems, just like an anthill has a lot more intelligence than the individual ants, or, as Peterson likes to discuss, because it's a topic that he understands more deeply, because it evolved as a story through which an individual developmentally is likely to go through, such as the stories of being traumatized and then being able to go back into your tribe, or the story of being a low status male that moves out into the outer world, deals with nature, fights a dragon, finds the riches, comes back, shares the riches, and increases their evolutionary value over time. So there are several different levels at which evolution accumulates the organization of information, and only one of those levels is the explicit language that we use when we discuss. And to some extent, I think Sam is insufficiently modest when he contends that we should find reasons to all the moral actions we take. Of course, he's right about there being incredible atrocities that seem to be justified by sacred texts and by archetypal texts, and his moral landscape makes a good case for several of those instances. And yet, that doesn't imply or mean that we should subject ourselves to an enslavement of that of which the individual human brain is capable of reasoning morally through in order to determine our morality. There may be things that existed through vaster and longer evolutionary time spans that we have yet to capture what exactly is baby and what exactly is bathwater. So it isn't unsound to take conservative principles into consideration in order to determine, to what extent should exploration be made in the space of possible morality. Which is part of Peterson's point, is that as you begin to thrive more and more in your ability to ascend through those personality transforming stories and archetypal mythologies, eventually you rise into the meta understanding that to be at the top of the collection of all hierarchies is, in a sense, to be able to explore without letting your society deteriorate into shambles, but also being sufficiently conservative and to some extent even dogmatic, that you don't tamper too much with a castle of cards that might have far too many properties for the individual human brain to capture. So to the extent that these evolutionary traits evolved for group selection or for a particular population to thrive, there's a further question there, which is groups cannot suffer, right? Individuals can suffer, individuals can be happy and flourish. So there should definitely be a discount to the extent that even if we do find an evolutionary reasoning for the evolution of a group to be a particular way, that doesn't imply necessarily that we should take it into account morally with anywhere near the same weight as what happens to individuals, because individuals are capable of suffering and groups aren't. This is actually the point that Peterson makes in his presumptuous letter to the world in the last day of 2016, maybe. Further down the dialogue, Sam makes the point that we don't need to find the best interpretation of the worst story in order to go about reasoning through our morality. And I think that the counter-argument to that here, from this longer time span perspective, is that we have to give evolution the benefit of the doubt to some extent, because since there are these multiple levels of intelligence, and by definition we only have conscious access to one of them, and there might be levels of complexity higher and levels of complexity lower than the levels that we have access to, that still are prerequisites to maintain a stable population over longer time spans of time, then the implication of that is that, yes, sometimes we should in fact try to find the best interpretation of an archetypal mythology, of an organized story, even of a movie that had sufficiently many people interested in it that it probably resonates with something deep in the human soul psychology, let's say, in the long-term evolutionary spans through which our brains evolved, yeah, we should actually give the benefit of the doubt to those processes, which has been done in the work of many thinkers. I guess, the three ones that come to mind most obviously are Jung, Joseph Campbell, and René Girard, all of whom tried to find commonalities in those anthropological extended arguments, and whom, instead of trying to justify them from the armchair perspective of what should an individual human do, which is what Sam proposes to a great extent, actually just concedes that there's something to be said for these long time spans as evolutionary guidelines. There's a paper by Nick Bostrom and I think Anders Sandberg from 2009, which argues for precisely that claim, that even though there is an is-ought fallacy and the naturalistic fallacy isn't bonkers, there's still potentially valuable moral information in the evolutionary process merely in virtue of it allowing the extended survival of a system, and because tampering with systems that we don't fully understand sometimes causes their demise. Peterson mentions, going back to the idea of sacrifice, that sacrifice is progressively psychologized in the Bible, which means, from his perspective, that to the extent that the Western culture has increased in its capability to deal with moral ideas, then it has more and more incorporated in the text the fact that the value of sacrifice is the value of the abstract concept of sacrifice, and not of the sacrifice of a specific goat or of a specific child or something like that. This would also be an indication that, to the extent that some societies are better than others, as Sam would argue in the moral landscape, if you had a societal rank and those societies have branched off evolutionarily, then Peterson is making the case that there are morally valuable features of specific textual and religious analysis of narrative and psychology, even at the furthest branches of this evolutionary tree. That is, not every archetypal transformation and personality transformation that is valuable has been incorporated early on in religions, but as time went by, more and more of the valuable layers of understanding have been grafted upon prior layers, so that, let's say, newer religions are in a sense more likely to be evolutionarily and morally instructive in ways that prior religions weren't. An interesting case in point here is René Girard's thesis that one of the main differences between the Bible containing 2 books and the Bible containing 1 book, which is the sacrifice of Jesus, is a containment mechanism for an anthropological, universal, violent outlet that many societies have, where either they kill an alpha male or they kill a particular individual who isn't necessarily being guilty of the violence in which the group tends to unfold over the course of a few decades or something like that. So Girard makes the case that the Christian part of the Bible has basically been the grafting of a symbolic mechanism that substitutes for the actual violent mechanism of scapegoating, which was very common in prior society time, so that we are reminded constantly of the sacrifice of Jesus, and that prevents us, or at least reduces the rate at which we sacrifice individuals for the felt perception that now the violence is gone, that now the group is going to thrive again, and now the group is going to rise again. This is also discussed in Peter Thiel's book 0 to 1, where he talks about the scapegoating mechanism and how it affects startup culture and other subsets of society. So this evolutionary grafting, to the extent that some societies can be measurably described to be better than others and have survived through evolutionary time, one could say that there is going to be the progressive grafting of further and further moral wisdom. And an interesting point there is that the Mormon religion is an even further grafting of information over the prior 2 books of the Bible, and at least so far it has been expanding at a rather fast rate, which means that it is evolutionarily sustainable. It has all the properties that Peterson ascribes to that which is more moral than its predecessors in a way, except that it hasn't grown sufficiently much for us to be able to evaluate whether it will survive evolutionary time, basically whether it will resist the test of time in the way that the Christian Bible has. So it could be that it just captured a particular feature of the relevant problems that happened in the time of its creation, and that its morals are no longer sufficiently valid for it to accrue anywhere near the level of power that Christianity accrued over the Jewish tradition that preceded it. But that remains to be seen. Evolutionary timescale has not elapsed long enough for us to be able to know that. Sam mentions that the problem is dogmatism in general, and dogmatism, if we're thinking about an evolutionary perspective, has these two sides. So maybe the dogmatism is just intelligence being expressed at a higher level that we can't really understand. So like the first 5 commandments of the Bible are basically sound from a game theoretical perspective because they allow you to determine which particular substructure of individuals you're going to interface with and who you can trust. So when you say thou shalt not have other gods before me, it means thou shalt not play any game theoretic strategies that are not within the scope of those allowed by this religion, so that we know that all the people here are playing the same game. And to the extent that there's also the belief in miracles and sacred values as part of what determines religious affiliation, you can also think about that as a population level game theoretic strategy, where by costly signaling that you believe a particular set of miracles that seem extremely unbelievable from the outside, then you're giving a very costly signal that you are willing to engage in that particular game with that particular set of rules, with that particular group, and therefore the group as a whole might end up accruing more benefits over time. So the belief in miracles and the existence of miracles in those narrative stories, and the existence of unreasonable beliefs, and also food-related shibboleths are all cheat detection mechanisms in order to know how far you are from the center of behavior that organized the evolutionary structure that let that population survive over time. So like, let's say that there are 15 miracles and 12 different behavioral rules that you're supposed to follow that are absolutely unreasonable from an armchair individual perspective. The more you costly signal that you participate in each one of those actions, right, to the extent that you're willing to go through the cost of sounding irrational in those particular ways and behaving in those particular unusual or unexpected or costly ways, the more certainty someone else who belongs to the same game will know that you are a participant in that unit of selection. And therefore, they will know with more certainty that they can trust you to follow a particular set of rules. In fact, in military exercises, I think there was a paper that came out last year or so, where there's increased bonding between male allies if they have to go through a tough struggle together. And this is, of course, used in armies and different groups all over the world, where if you go through a sacrifice together, or if you go through miracle witnessing exercise together, or if you do a collective exercise of claiming something that is false, your level of identity to that particular group is going to increase, which will lead you to both trust them more to follow the rules that they specify for themselves, and them to do the same for you. So it's not that religion is irrational itself, it's just that religion includes a bunch of mechanisms of cheat detection to know whether you are or not part of the unit of selection for religion, which is a population and not an individual. And those shibboleths, those miracles, those costly determinants of which group do you belong to will accurately allow people to quickly disengage with those who are less trustworthy to behave within that particular framework. So to wrap it up, the way I think evolutionary anthropology brings a lot of knowledge and information to the Peterson versus Harris debate is that it's not a debate about religion and whether religion is valuable or not. Religion is valuable as long as you're thinking from the population perspective, because religion is, to a great extent, the crystallization of a set of stories, rituals, and behaviors, plus the costly signaling mechanisms which tell you to say a bunch of things that are very costly to signal if you're not a member of that group, but that might pay off as a member of that group, which means that you will defend that group and participate in a set of structural rules that that group abides by, so your behavior becomes more predictable. The same thing happens in constitutional systems, so when you know to whose jurisdiction a particular person belongs to, you will know a little bit more about their behavior when you know to which nation they belong to, which group they belong to, which tribe they evolved in, etc. So All of those are differently concentric mechanisms to determine these population allegiances so that you know what you're dealing with. And religion is just a little bit more explicit in its usage of the human mind's unwillingness to say and partake in irrational behavior and belief, and uses that as the costly signaling mechanism for participating or not participating in an individual group. So if you only do the armchair philosophy thing of trying to reason through how morality should be thought of, we will forget these evolutionarily long time scales, and we will forget the fact that some levels of intelligence and complexity that have moral value are explicitly visible at the level of the individual, but some of them have evolved for populations. So basically the two things that are invisible to us are that which evolved for a time span far longer than our lives, and that which evolved for a group that is far wider than our individuality. And I think that what connects these two perspectives without having to go into the metaphysical paraphernalia involved in the religious stories is basically this perspective that there's three different things that are operating as guidelines to our morality, right? One is what is useful for us to the extent that we can reason right now, and that is where Sam is at his best, because he can talk about consciousness and individual suffering and individual happiness very well. Then there's the intelligence at the population level, which I think both of them are kind of missing, but it is the domain where religion is at its best, and the long-term evolutionary time spans, which is where archetypal stories, mythical narrative, personality transformations, etc. are at their best. So the most valuable information there will be... So religion is going to inform you about the population level morality. Individual reasoning and philosophy are going to inform you about individual level morality. And archetypal stories, personalities, narratives are going to inform you about these vast evolutionary time spans. And because there is moral value not only in what happens to me right now today, but also to my group, and also to my group in longer time spans, all of these three have to be considered in the moral equation, and all of them will have different rates of update. So to the extent that the question is dogma valuable, is a valuable question, well, you have to consider the entire triangle in order to determine like to what extent that particular dogma is valuable, and your rate of update can't be so quick that your population dies out, but it can also not be so slow that you are forced into keeping dogmatic tyranny despite having increased the amount of resources or the amount of value that can be gained per time unit by the collective group of consciousnesses that constitutes your group at a faster rate than ever, for instance, because you got rich. So that's basically my perspective on the debate between Peterson and Harris. I hope you enjoyed it. Please click subscribe and whatever it is that people say at the end of those videos. I'm Diego Caleiro. I'm an evolutionary anthropologist and philosopher. I wrote a book about Daniel Dennett. I think by now I must have watched at least 200 hours of Peterson content. I've read both of his books. I've read Waking Up, The Moral Landscape. I've dealt with moral philosophy for a fair amount of time in my life. I love evolutionary biology. I hope you like this channel, and stay with me till next time.